access phone number and the access code. And just a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone is muted, and we will keep you muted. You can type in any questions you have in the questions box. We will take questions at the end, and Mark will also look for questions during. So there's about 5 different sections of the presentation. So if you do have a question, type it in when you have it, and then we can address it during the session. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to verbally ask a question. And we will record this, and we'll send out a link to the recording afterwards. So that way, if you missed any parts or you'd like to share it with your team. So again, we're going to go ahead and do Naked and Afraid, Re-implementing Microsoft Dynamics GP Security. And I'd like to welcome Mark Polino. Mark's on our Fastpath team. He's also a Microsoft MVP and a GPUG All-Star. So Mark, I will make you the presenter and hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Trish. Just double check you can hear me and see my screen.
Yep.
All right.
Good.
Well, thanks everybody for being here. We are looking at Naked and Afraid, Re-implementing Dynamics GP Security, just to make sure everybody's in the right place. Naked and Afraid is both a Discovery Channel TV show. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty interesting. And it's how a lot of people feel when they're told that they're responsible for GP security. We get a lot of deer in the headlight looks, people say, when they find out that they're responsible. So it's kind of scary for folks. So just a quick disclaimer, despite the title, no one will be naked during this presentation. So you can feel pretty comfortable that you'll be fine. You don't have to hide this from small children, and it is safe to view at work. You are, however, allowed to be afraid if you're suddenly responsible for GP security. And we decided to tackle this from a re-implementing GP security standpoint, because lots of people have set up GP security, but they come back and they say, you know, we don't trust it. We have a lot of people who are power users. It was set up 5 years ago, and all we keep doing is saying, well, this person has the same permission as that person, and we hope that that's right. So folks come and they say, we'd like to re-implement GP security, or they get a new CFO who isn't happy with the way it's set up and really wants to make sure that they understand it, same kind of feedback from auditors. So we're tackling this from the perspective of you already have GP security, but you're not happy with it, you're not happy with the setup. If you're new implementing GP security, all of this works as well. So the world is pretty insecure. It's not hard to pick up the phone and see, or pick up a web page and take a look at it and see things like, you know, $20 million stolen from a credit union in Michigan a couple of weeks back. All kinds of other headlines around internal control problems, which is usually code for we did something really bad. So it can really be a scary place. We want you to have confidence in your GP security setup, and so that's really what we're trying to tackle here. So part of the challenge is there's a lot of components to Dynamics GP security. We're going to touch on all of these. There is the traditional Dynamics GP security, where you go into Dynamics GP and you set up users and you assign roles and permissions and roles and tasks and all that sort of thing. But then GP also works with SQL Server reporting services. It has its own set of security. And sometimes people think, well, you know, report security isn't as big a deal. And it's generally not until you run into something like folks who have payroll access inappropriately because they can run reports. Management Reporter, which is the default financial reporting tool for GP. Again, some folks say, well, you know, we're not as worried about who has access to this until you run into somebody who is releasing financials early or who is able to inappropriately change information, and then your financial statements are incorrect. Dynamics GP, newer versions, 2013 R2 and forward, have workflow. And this actually has its own security separate from core Dynamics GP security. It works with Active Directory, not Dynamics GP users. So that one's a little different. The GP web client has its own kind of idiosyncrasies as well. And then spreadsheets. So in terms of your full financial piece, not maybe just GP, but an awful lot of folks end up using spreadsheets for different things. This may be spreadsheets that get are used to facilitate input into Dynamics GP. But certainly we see that in an audit, a spreadsheet can absolutely be within scope for the audit. So it's something you're going to need to think about. And then any other products. This could be integrating products. It could be any number of other things, third parties that may or may not plug into GP. But if that data flows into GP, you've got to make sure that you've got a handle on it. All right, we are going to start with GP security. It's the most complicated, and it's also the core of all of this. If you get GP security right, and you follow what we're going to show you for GP security, this process will work for all of the others, and it's really kind of simple and straightforward to tackle. The others are much easier than GP once you've got this down. So just a quick review on GP security. It is role-based, so we assign windows, reports, the ability to post, all of that go into a task. Multiple tasks are combined into roles, and then roles are assigned to users. We're going to tackle our security re-implementation process here. Really, we've got 5 major steps. These are around, we're going to design security. We're going to have a review applied to it. We will then go ahead and apply security. So we'll change our roles and tasks and users and all of that. We'll do some testing, and then we'll make adjustments after the fact. This is not a theoretical kind of presentation where we say there are 6 different ways to do this, and here's how they work and the pros and cons. This is much more of a presentation where we're going to make some really specific recommendations on what we've seen work, and what we've seen work tends to be either this process or a close variation on this process. So that's what we're going for here, is to give you something practical to work off of. All right, so let's look at design. Most folks, when they initially set up GP, do not do a true security design. They kind of poke around at what they want users to be able to do and not do. There's some consideration maybe given to basic segregation of duties, but that's about it. Really, you need to sit down and design what you want your security to do. When you design your security, it tends to be much more comprehensive because you're thinking about it. You think about things that maybe you don't catch on the first pass, and after you thought about it a couple of times, they come up. It tends to be less vulnerable because it is more comprehensive. You've thought through all the possible scenarios. Because there's a design document of what security is supposed to look like, it's much easier to audit, which can also help reduce audit costs. And designed security is risk-based. And by that I mean, when you're designing your security, you're really concentrating on the most important pieces first, the items that have the highest risk first, in order to be able to get the most security fastest set up inside of Dynamics GP. So just a kind of a quick comment on risk-based. In almost every organization, there's a risk that if you don't control your cache, it is going to walk out the door. That's pretty much a given. Things for other organizations can be variable. In the case of Heineken, they're a beer distributor, beer manufacturer. They have a lot of risk around inventory and product disappearing. So, they need to be very worried about that. A retail-based operation has to be very concerned with cash. That's a significant piece for them. In most cases, they do not have to be overly concerned with their risks around accounts receivable, short of maybe their credit card companies, because folks are paying at the register. They don't have large amounts of accounts receivable. So a retail store that focuses a lot of time and effort on controlling their accounts receivable risk is really wasting time that could be spent somewhere else, someplace that is better suited for that particular organization. All right, so what's in a role? security often starts by people, they look at the GP out-of-box roles and they say, that person's pretty much an AP clerk or an AR clerk. Boom, you're good to go. That doesn't really work well, because really what you want is you want roles that don't have overlapping tasks. And what you find inside of GP is that the roles have lots of overlapping tasks. So an AP clerk, an AP supervisor, and another AP role may all have the ability to create a vendor. Well, now when someone says what role is allowed to create a vendor, it's not a single role. It could be multiple roles. It makes it a whole lot tougher to ensure that you've really locked someone down. We do have some documentation. Jivtache, Microsoft MVP, has this is an Excel sheet, so there's a link here, that lists all of the default roles in GP and the associated tasks. So when you look at that, it's pretty straightforward to see that there's lots of overlap. We've got a bunch of links throughout this presentation. Most of the items are free. In a couple of cases, the best resource is a paid resource, so we'll point that out as well. But the default role and task documentation is free, and it's kind of a great document. So because the GP roles are really kind of messy, what we really recommend is a task-based approach. So we're going to be designing our security, but we're really looking at this from a task standpoint. The tasks in GP are actually really, really good. There's not a lot of overlap. They tend to include all of the tables that you need. You don't have to go find that table. Just as an example, in GP manufacturing, there is a hidden table named hidden. And so to know that you have to assign the hidden table named hidden to a task is really pretty obscure. The default tasks already include stuff like that. So that's why we don't recommend starting from pure scratch, because you're going to miss a lot of those things and just create pain for yourself. If you start with the tasks in GP, you're going to go a long, long way. And so what you'll do is ultimately you're going to take these tasks and you're going to combine them into new roles. All right. So what we recommend is that you use a tool to figure out which tasks belong to which role. We have one that's free. It's the GP Security Matrix. It looks a lot like this. This is just the purchasing section. There's a tab for each section in GP. Across the top are the built-in tasks. So print 1099s is a task in GP. Period end purchasing routines is a task in GP, etc. And then down the left will be your new roles. And what's nice about this is because there is a sheet for the different modules in GP, you could take the sheet just for purchasing, give it to the people who know how purchasing works, and have them make X's and create roles that they think are appropriate. All we're doing is creating an Excel sheet at this point in time. We haven't changed anything in GP because we're really designing our security. These are pretty well named. So maintain customer vendor relationships. That's the ability to link customers and vendors together. The risk with that particular piece is that I could create a either an incorrect relationship or a dummy vendor and ultimately support dummy refunds. But again, if that's not a risk, if your company is in the type of business where you really don't issue many refunds, then that's something that can go on the back burner. You really want to focus on the items that are higher risk for your organization. But again, the beauty of this security matrix is you can send it out to folks, mark it up, and then bring them all back together and essentially fight about it, argue about where these things go. But it also lets you look at them from a segregation of duty standpoint. It's not perfect. We'll show you some better ways to do it kind of down the road, but it is certainly a starting point. It's fairly easy to look at this and say, I shouldn't be able to maintain customer-vendor relationships and maintain vendors and addresses. That's probably a bad idea. Most accountants can figure that out pretty well. So this gives you something to be able to work with from that standpoint to be able to associate your new roles with the tasks that you want. And so on this sheet, we would add roles as required. If there are tasks, the sheet is pretty comprehensive, but for example, if you add SafePay adds 2 of its own tasks. Those can just be added to the sheet at the end as tasks that you want to tack on. We don't recommend using or modifying the existing roles. The rationale behind this is if I create a new role and I put someone in it for, let's say, payroll clerk, and then we find in our testing or we find in production that the payroll clerk can't do something that they need to do, we at least then have the original role for a period of time to go and figure out what we might have missed in terms of adding a task. Really, you're not going to keep them forever, but you're going to keep them for a period of time to ensure that folks have this ability to validate what they might have had before. Also, there's a default user task that holds a bunch of basic things like the ability to access the home screen and access some of the smart list pieces and all of that. So don't forget to add default user tasks to the roles that you're creating. And then kind of finally here, this can be phased. So the beauty of this is you could say we think that in our organization, cash is the highest risk. So we're going to take all of the financial and checkbook pieces and we're going to build new roles based on tasks there. We're going to have people review it and we're going to set those up. And that's our project from now to the end of next month. We're not going to worry about any other security to start with. All we're going to worry about is that. And then the next piece might be accounts payable or accounts receivable or whatever's appropriate for your company. But because this can be phased, you don't necessarily have to say, okay, we're going to take the next 2 years and rebuild our security from scratch. And on one day, we're going to flip a switch and hope we get all new security. No, you can actually layer this in as you go through. All right, I'm going to take a quick break here. And let's see, do we have any questions hanging around?
I don't see any yet. Mark?
Okay.
Yet.
Fantastic. So let's talk about some real world tips here. Power user is a default role inside of GP, but it is technically not a role. It's an override. What you need to know is that it doesn't say, oh, does power user have access to add a vendor, yes or no? It just says, oh, you're a power user, fine, you can do whatever you want. What this means is when you pull reports to say who can create journal entries, power user does not apply. When you pull reports to say who can post journal entries, power user does not show up, even though a power user can do both of those things. So when you go to your auditors and say, here's a list of everyone who can create journal entries, and they look through the system and say, why can Andy create journal entries? Andy is not on my list. It's because Andy is a power user. The best example I have of this is George Clooney. Power user is George Clooney. If you go to a club on a Saturday night and your name is not on the list, you're going to stand in line until someone decides to let you in. They're going to check your name against that list, against permission to go in, against permission to get in the VIP room, whatever. When the manager walks out and goes, show me who came in tonight, they can say, here's all of the people based on the list that we said people we were going to allow in. George Clooney is not on any of those lists, but when he shows up, he gets in. That's what power user is like. So we strongly recommend against power user. If you must have a power user role, I did a blog post a while back on how to manually create your own super user role. So this is just like power user, but it actually has explicit permission to do everything, so it will show up on the reports. So that's my power user preaching. A couple of SA tips, because we run into this as well. In all of the newer versions of GP, SA is only required for installation. Certainly 2013 and forward, SA is only required for installation. The professional services tools that are in 2013 do not require SA. The user can be modified at the SQL level to be able to do any of those tools without being SA. So there's a couple of things here on reducing the usage of SA, and then how to use SA to add, how to use something other than SA to add new users. What you'd really like to be able to do when you audit this down the road is say the person who added the new user was Mark or Liz or Joe, not SA, and oh, by the way, 10 people have the SA password, so we really don't know who added this user. You really want to tightly control SA. All right, so what we've done is we take our security matrix, we focus on the items where we think we have our biggest risks, we lay them out and do our best to tackle segregation of duties, and then we're going to review that. And so in our review, we're going to look for two things. Role conflicts are segregation of duties issues within a role. So if I say this is an AP clerk, and I see that they're able to create vendors and create checks, that's a role conflict. We're going to want to fix that by creating another role and separating those out. User conflicts happen when I've got pretty good roles, but I assign a user to more than one role. I assign a user the AP clerk role, and which allows them to create vouchers, and the AP check generation role, which allows them to cut checks. We'll kind of tackle, those are a little tougher to find when you're designing security, but we'll show you some options to be able to deal with that. Honestly, the best option is once you have got this security done and applied in a test company and you're ready to test it, for example, or even if you've applied it in production and just haven't assigned any users to it, our Assure product, so Fastpath Assure, is a tool that goes through GP security and finds segregation of duties conflicts, both at the role level and at the user level. And it lets you either fix those or explain how you're mitigating against those. So maybe, yes, you have a role conflict where folks are allowed to enter a voucher and create a check, but you have a separate process where someone validates that the voucher was correct, the backup for the voucher, that the check was correct before that ever gets signed or before it ever goes to a signer. You can document that to be able to show, hey, we know we have a conflict, here's how we're mitigating it. Assure is a paid product. It's a Fastpath product. We're pretty proud of it, and honestly, it does a really nice job. I have found some kind of rinky-dink segregation of duties tools on the web, and they always seem to disappear after about a month or two. So I don't have any idea why. I have a small collection of them that I can't give out because I don't have rights to them to distribute them, but they all seem to disappear. So really Assure is the product for figuring out segregation of duties. This will really be, we'll talk about this at the end, but this is really where you're going to kind of double check that all this work that you've done is working the way you want it to, and maybe do some adjustments or tweaks. That's really what we're talking about here is a conflict matrix, and that's what Assure does. If you want to do a conflicts matrix by hand, you absolutely can. You're going to pull a whole bunch of reports from GP, and you're going to try to match those reports. It's incredibly painful. It can be done, but you're not going to want to do it again after you do it the first time. You will be tempted and you will be pushed by people to build roles that have absolutely no conflicts. You'll be tempted to have users that have absolutely no conflicts. This is a great goal, but there are some practical problems with it. The one we talk about the most is that it's just you can't hire enough people to have no conflicts. But even if you did hire enough people to have no conflicts, your process would be incredibly inefficient. One person would enter a voucher, a second person would validate that they entered it correctly, and that would be their whole job. Another person not included in that would then process that voucher. By the time you actually got a check cut, it would be costing you, $100 a check. It's just not efficient. So what you want to do is do the absolute best you can, focusing on risk. So you'd like to have your conflicts in areas with lower areas of risk in terms of the process. And then conflict mitigation. Often this is things like we have a report that is reviewed. So when I was a controller, we didn't have a very big staff. We had a senior accountant who once a week would review all of the new vendors that were created and vendor address changes. The AP clerks would provide copies to support address changes and information to support new vendors, and we had a review and sign-off process. Assure also supports that review and sign-off process for mitigations. Once you've designed this security, you're also going to have a sign-off process. Someone's going to sign off to say, yep, we've had a bunch of people review this, and we think this is the security that we want to set up. Now your auditors have something to work with. You've got something to work with. If security gets changed, you can say, well, this is how we designed it. Why did this thing change? And we'll sort of get to that in a minute, but really you're going to want to have sign-offs there. And then you're going to test this security. Again, this is a big, big benefit for phasing this in. You really hate to switch security for the whole company and start getting calls all over the place. If you do it for just AP or just finance, you end up in much better shape. So we're going to set our security. We're going to create new roles. We're going to apply tasks to those new roles. We're going to temporarily preserve the existing roles, all of that sort of thing. And run some reports, review the security roles and user assignments match the matrix. Assure will do that. GP has some tools to do that. They're not as pretty. We're pretty happy with how pretty Assure looks versus the GP reports. You do want to test this. What's going to happen is you will run into some folks who maybe had some unusual permissions, and you're going to need to decide if they need to keep them or not. That's really where we go back to the design and we say what makes sense from a risk-based standpoint. But it doesn't matter how much you test, you are going to have to adjust. What happens is inevitably you change security, and the day after you change security, you get a phone call. I used to be able to do this, and now I can't do that. You will need folks available to be able to approve or deny. It may just be, oh, we forgot that they do that job. Yeah, that's fine. Or it may be, no, we've specifically redesigned the process so that person isn't doing that job. Someone else is going to do that piece. In that case, it just needs to be communicated. This is not always a short process. The first day or two, most of them come in, but there are often people who are only in GP once a month. They're the folks who I go in, I pull this report, I take this number off this report, and I put it in a spreadsheet to support some other operation. Or I only go in once a month to make this journal entry that adjusts these things. So it may be a month or two, even conceivably a quarter, depending on what people do, where there's still some adjustment to get that security just right. But after the first day or two, it typically settles down pretty quickly. I'm going to come. Oh, yeah, that works. Sorry. A tool that we find works really, really well is GP Power Tools. This is Microsoft MVP and former Microsoft employee David Musgrave has a suite of tools that was formerly the support debugging tool. When you're adjusting security, what will happen is folks will get an error message that says something like access to this window has been denied. GP Power Tools will tell you what window it was denied access to, and can let you actually drill down into who has access to that window based on a role, task, and user standpoint, and why. These are the 4 roles that have access, and this user doesn't have one of these 4 roles. So we find for the adjust phase, the support debugging tool is really the single best tool out there. It's not particularly expensive, so I find that's really helpful as you're reworking security. Just an example, it sort of looks like this. Here's a security profile, for example. You can see whether access was granted. We've got you don't have access, and this gets modified to actually show the window that was denied access and the dictionary that was denied access, so we know that this is in field service, for example. In real life, when you're rebuilding GP security, this is not a fast process. It just isn't. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing. You really want to treat this as a project, and if you can phase it, say, well, we're going to do this month and this the next month, and be able to lay out a plan to get to better security, especially if you're tackling the high-risk stuff first. You're usually able to satisfy the auditors to say, we're redoing security, we've tackled these high-risk things, here's our plan to get from A to Z. Then next time they'll come back and test that you followed that plan and did what you said you were going to do. That tends to be really useful from an audit standpoint. And the nice part is once this is done, you usually don't have to spend a whole lot of time on maintenance and adjustments. If you've got good, clean roles with solid tasks behind them, it's pretty easy to be able to set up another user. You can still copy from one user to another, and it will copy all of the roles and tasks from one user to another user, but then you can be confident that that new user is getting what they're supposed to have. A couple of little things, limited and self-serve users are relatively new to GP. There are tasks for limited users. So a limited user has permission to view data in GP and do certain activities. They can do some approvals with respect to things like requisitions and payroll and those types of things. But generally, they are a read-only type of user, but there are some pre-built, I believe they're pre-built roles for limited users. So this is a limited user that can only see financial information, or a limited user that can only see distribution information. You won't be able to give a limited user access to other roles. They'll be restricted in terms of what roles they can have, and they're going to get one of those limited roles. When you set up a user, you define it as a limited user based on the license. And then self-service users are really web client primarily users for things like creating a requisition, submitting a timesheet, that type of thing. They also have some limited roles that prevent them. It really keeps them inside the box. So maybe you have a limited user that's allowed to create requisitions, but not timesheets because they're not an hourly user. You can control access there, but you're not going to be able to give them access beyond the maximum that a self-service user can have. All right. So our security process of design, review, apply, test, and adjust works well for the other GP products, the other related security products as well. It just tends to be a much faster process because security on those tends to not be as complex. It's not that it's any less secure. Sometimes there are simply fewer options to select, or you want fewer users in them in the case of something like Management Reporter, where most folks only have a few users accessing Management Reporter directly. So I'm going to stop here before we go into SSRS and just see if we have any kind of questions. We do. Is there a migration path for getting security from a development to a production environment? Yes, there is. I have to remember what it is. I know that the support debugging tool will copy it from a test company to a production company, and there is another path, but I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. So I will get that, and we'll post that on the blog. That way everybody can get it, if that seems fair. All right. With that, let's take a look at some of the others. SQL Server reporting services. Security tends to be pretty straightforward. Really, you're going to assign people access to either folders or individual reports. Most people use folders. If you're in the financial folder, you can run any of the financial reports, but you can't get to the payroll folder. That's the typical security that we see, but you can restrict people to actual reports. SSRS uses Active Directory, so network logins, not GP logins. So SSRS users do not have to be GP users. They can run reports without being a GP user. GP provides some SQL roles for access to the underlying data. You will need to give them access to that underlying data in addition to the report. There's a set of RPT roles for the default GP reports. But here, what happened? Basically what we're looking at is, a lot of your folks will get access to browser role, which means they can view folders, reports, and they can subscribe to reports. So basically, they can run a report. Most of the others are around managing content. So Publisher allows you to actually publish a report. Report Builder would let folks modify a report. Most of your folks are going to get browser in this particular case. So it's pretty straightforward to be able to get an idea of the modules that you're going to give folks access to and what role assignment they'll have. Management Reporter, the key is really limiting around what users can actually create reports. Again, Management Reporter also uses Active Directory, so these do not have to be GP users. In permissions, there's a set here of different types of permissions that you can grant folks. The ability to generate, the ability to drill back into GP, export building blocks, create reports, access to all companies. So you've got pretty good control. Again, generally what we see is 2 or 3 people have access to create reports, and everything else is around folks who are simply either generating or consuming reports. GP workflow. This is an interesting piece. With the introduction of workflow with GP 2013 R2, there's another security piece inside of GP. Workflow uses Active Directory users and groups. It does not use GP users. And essentially, this is used for things like approving requisitions, approving journal entries, timesheets, those types of things. So often the approver is not necessarily a GP user. That's why they're using Active Directory. The big key around security here is that you want to limit managers. And when you look at the window for setting up a workflow, there's a box here. This is managers. These are people who are allowed to create workflows. So they can create, change, adjust, whatever a workflow. So if you create a workflow that says we want all requisitions over $500 to be approved, and this person is able to change that to 5,000, get a workflow submitted through without approval, and then change it back to 500, that's going to be a problem. So you really want to control and limit the number of managers who are able to create workflows. But then here in the actual workflow, we assign a approver, one or more approvers based on a bunch of rules. So if it's over $500, it goes to this person. If it's over $10,000, it goes to somebody else, and the previous person also has to approve, whatever. So this is where we assign our users, and this also comes from Active Directory. The one other caveat, when you're doing workflow sends out an email for approval, and the user can click on a link from that email and log in and approve via the web. But that email must be the email that is set in their Active Directory. If their Active Directory does not have an email assigned to it, or it's an old one or an incorrect one, then the email is never going to go out for them to be able to approve that. So you do need to double check that. The GP web client is a weird piece of hybrid. This will be changing possibly with GP 2016, but for early 2013 and 2015, Active Directory is used to connect to the website, and then GP is used to actually access GP. There is a identity management type of thing designed to connect those two. It tends to be a pain in the butt to set up. Fastpath config AD seems to be a whole lot better in terms of making that work. And the GP piece only works on the web client. So this creates a disconnect. If users are switching back and forth between the desktop and the web client, they get a very different login experience. And it can make support a challenge when you have that different login experience as well. So config AD tends to be the better choice if you're wanting to have single sign-on for your users, regardless of their experience. But generally, the web client security is tied to GP security in terms of what they can do. So once they're logged in, they are subject to GP security. And you can have web client users that are not SQL users now. They do not appear in SQL Server at all. They are only GP users. The connection to SQL is done differently. It's not at a one-to-one user ratio. It's really using a generic connection into SQL and controlling security with GP security. See here, questions. How do I suggest dealing with updates and upgrades when new functionality may or may not have been added? So probably, one, when you do the upgrade to whatever the next version of GP is, I would be focused first on the new items. In other words, you could do a small security matrix just for the new features. There tends to be a couple of big ones and then a small slew of little ones to be able to address. So as part of your GP testing and upgrade process, Microsoft's going to provide you with a list of those items. So you can do sort of a quick mini version of a security matrix with the new pieces and roles that are there. All right. Just a quick look here. If you check this box, it says web client user only, directory account turns on, and that would be a non-SQL user. And then user type full, limited, or self-serve appears in the drop-down box up here in the right-hand side. All right, spreadsheets. I wanted to mention this briefly. You can have spreadsheets that are in scope for your audit, either ones that get data out of GP or are used to bring data into GP. I had a chat with folks from the Microsoft financial reporting team. So these are accountants who work at Microsoft. And they have 18 spreadsheets at Microsoft that are in scope for financial reporting. And I just wanted to briefly mention that there are some tools inside of Excel to be able to deal with that. The biggest one is if you're using Excel 2013 or higher, there's a tool included now that is called Inquire. It's in the add-ins. It's there by default. If you don't see it, just go to the add-ins and turn it on. And it really does kind of three important things. It can compare Excel files and identify the differences. So I can save up last month's file. I have this month's file. I compare the two. It will show me value changes, formula changes, and formula result changes based on those and those particular cells. So Microsoft uses this in addition to locking down their spreadsheets and who can make changes. They use this to prove what changes were made from month to month to the auditor. So they'll say, this is our old one, this is our new one. We generated a report, which Inquire will do, of all of the changes, and then they go through and they make an explanation of why each one of the items was changed to support their spreadsheet changes. And they said when they do that, they hand that to the auditor and they never get anything back. That's a way to be able to control and document the security around your spreadsheet. You're going to want to control who can get in them. You can document the changes. And then the Inquire tool will also trace connections to other sheets and trace connections to other cells. So you can document the spreadsheet to be able to prove that, hey, we don't have a number coming in for some stray spreadsheet over there on the left. All right, and so this is just a quick look at what Inquire looks like. So here I've just got a couple of things that came out of GP. These are user conflicts out of Assure, actually. So the green are formulas that changed, and we see here old value and new value. And the purple are formulas that changed. So here we had the formulas that changed, and then the sort of teal are a number that changed because a calculated value changed. So this is the type of thing that the Inquire tool does for spreadsheets that might be in scope for your audit as well. All right. So last piece, once you've made your changes to GP and updated your security, we've got a couple of tools that can really help. We talked about Assure. You run the Assure tool, it's going to show you what your role-based conflicts are and what your user-based conflicts are so that you can fix them before you put this into production. Or you can use Assure to document your mitigations. Also, if you have a process that requires folks to review this type of information on a regular basis, then Assure will let you sign off that you've done that review. Audit Trail and Audit View work together. The idea behind these two tools are once you have set security, you really want to make sure that it's working as expected. So maybe we're going to audit things like vendor creation to ensure that only people who have access, we did it right, and only people who have access are able to create vendors or change vendors along the way. Audit View allows you to take those audit reports and be able to email them out or deliver them on a scheduled basis to folks. So if it's my job to review new vendors every week, then once a week a report shows up in my inbox with all of the new vendors and vendor changes for me to be able to review that was generated through Audit Trail. And then Identity Manager and Config AD work together to really provide single sign-on and new employee provisioning. So this is after I've got my security set, and I really want to make sure that folks get it right going forward. Config AD lets us log in with just our network or Active Directory ID, so folks don't have to remember a bunch of IDs and you don't have to keep helping folks through their GP password. And then Identity Manager lets you request and optionally even set up new users working in conjunction with Config AD. So let me just tell you what scenario of what this would look like. I need to hire a new employee, and I've decided that I'm going to hire Jose as a new accountant. So I can go into Identity Manager and say, I need to hire a new accountant. This is his basic information. He needs to have access to GP in these roles. And he also may need access to some other product that we've got, and I note that there. Well, Identity Manager can then go out to someone to approve. They say, yes, we agree we're hiring Jose, and those permissions look fine for Jose. From there, depending on your settings, Jose can actually get set up in Active Directory, or a user can then set up Jose in Active Directory with those sets of permissions. So the idea is between Identity Manager and Config AD, the IT department can take back control of assigning GP users without actually having control over what's in the roles and tasks. So we could say, we're hiring Jose and we want him to have access to the accounting supervisor role. even if we want that control to be under the IT department, they say, fine, we've set up Jose, and from inside of Active Directory, they're able to go, yes, Jose has access to the accounting supervisor role, but they can't change what's in that role. So it really allows them to do a lot of that setup and provide additional segregation of duties on setting up new users in GP. And if you don't want that to go through the IT department, there's also flexibility to have it done by somebody else in the organization. So maybe you want a non-GP finance user to be able to set up GP users just as part of segregation of duties. We can do that as well between Config AD and Identity Manager. So the idea behind this is we want you to really think about security, not treat it as kind of an add-on that comes at the end of the project. If you really sit and work through the role task matrix, really isn't bad as a starting point to kind of get through and get a feel. And once you got that, it's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to say it's fast, but it's pretty straightforward to be able to do. And once you've got your security set, we've got a ton of tools to help you make sure that it's right and to help keep it right after that. All right. We're going to take some questions here. Don't see any others hanging around. Anybody else with questions? All right, nothing so far. If you have additional questions, please just info@gofastpath.com. You can hit us on Twitter. My information is all over the place. It's mark.polino@gofastpath.com. So I'd love to hear from you. I will pull together a migration path from test to production, and we'll figure out how to get that on the blog in the next few days here. And that way everybody can benefit from it. All right, with that, we're going to say we're done and let everybody go. Hope you guys have a great afternoon. Thanks again.